Thank you very much indeed, Maya. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate that. And what a wonderful place to go. How many people have been to the Linnean Society before, out of interest? Show of hands. So about half. Okay, that's great. Well, it's my first time giving a talk here. So that's a terrific opportunity for me. You've had a kind of little bit of background, so I won't dwell on that for too long. But basically, I think of my job, I write books and I give talks predominantly all over the place in schools and museums and at literary festivals and all over the world, actually, in Japan a lot, which is quite interesting. So I've been over to Japan a lot. People say, what do you specialize in? You know, if you write books, what do you specialize in? And I specialize in zooming out. That's basically what I try to do. I try to connect things together. And, you know, in our modern culture, we're so obsessed with looking at little specialisms and fragments of knowledge, you know. And many of you, I'm sure, how many of you are studying biology, for example? Could have some show of hands. Quite a lot. Fantastic. Okay, great. So you're all becoming experts in, you know, this amazing story of life on Earth, which is an amazing story. But even though you're biologists, I suspect there aren't very many opportunities where you take a step back and look at the 4 billion year story of life on Earth and try and see the themes that connect everything together. It's very difficult to do in our modern culture. Actually, it wasn't always the case. You know, Leonardo da Vinci, he was a kind of Renaissance man, wasn't he? And he connected everything together. And they did the same thing in ancient Greece. It just seems to be we're going through a phase of fragmenting knowledge into little fragments. And when you try and look at the big picture, you often find yourself looking at a pane of shattered glass because it just doesn't connect, because nobody speaks the same language, because they've all got their own technical terms, etc., etc. So I make it my job to try and find ways of connecting knowledge together and making this story accessible to all ages, to people who aren't experts, to people who are senior citizens, all the way through down to 4 or 5-year-olds, and everything in between. So this particular story is based on my second history of the world. I wrote two. The first one, What on Earth Happened, goes from, I thought I'd write the biggest story you could possibly imagine. So I started off 13.7 billion years ago with the Big Bang, all the way through to Snapchat. I don't know if you've come across that. Anyway, there we are. And it goes all the way through in 42 chapters, which some of you will know is the meaning of life anyway. And it's got lots of pictures and maps. Quite a long, big, long book, but it's easy to read. And once I'd written that, and it all finishes off really with this amazing species, modern humans, of which there are just over 7 billion, by the way, now, which is rather amazing if you think about it. Do you know how many more people there will be in the world this time tomorrow? On top of those that have died, there will be an extra 219,000 people on the planet Earth, net, which is rather amazing if you think about it. You know, it's just a staggering number, isn't it, every day. So, and then somebody told me how many chickens there are in the world. Any thoughts, any guesses? How many chickens on the planet Earth? We've got some biology teachers here. There's one called Richard over there. Any thoughts, sir? How many chickens? Give us a guess. More. 14 billion chickens. Can you imagine? Well, somebody's done a study, and apparently at any one moment on the planet Earth, there are 24 billion chickens, which is rather amazing as well. And it made me think, actually, you know, it's all very well telling these big stories from the perspective of human beings, but what about chickens? I mean, they must have got an amazing story. I mean, the chicken gene's doing very well. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll write another history, this one, Life on Earth, so we'll just do the 4 billion years, and I'll focus on 100 species that changed the world. And since then, I've been doing these timelines. You can see one of them here. This is 1,000 species on a 4 billion year timeline, from a bacteria all the way through to you and me over here. And again, it's amazing to see how you can see the temperatures change and the geological eras and the plate tectonics, and all of these are relevant to the adaptations of nature as you go through time. So you begin to see how things actually affect one another across disciplines. So it's not just biology, it's geology and it's climate change, it's all these different things together. And of course, humans come in right at the end of the story, etc., etc. And so these timelines, I call them wall books, because you can read them like books, and on one side is a sort of narrative from Aristotle and Theophrastus. Do you know about Theophrastus? Does he ring a bell? Interesting guy, okay. He's a botanist in the ancient Greece, and he goes all the way through these sort of key discoveries through Linnaeus there, of course, and Hutton and Mendel and Darwin and DNA and all the rest of it. So that's a sort of narrative of the history of natural science, and then the other side is the 1,000 species from a bacteria to a human. And by reading it like a book or spreading it out on the floor or hanging it on the wall, it makes it quite a nice way of telling a big story. So there are these books on history and nature and science and inventions and all that kind of stuff. In fact, very exciting, I've just done a sticker book one for young people. Actually, this is really for adults, but young people can enjoy it too. Anybody likes sticker books? You've got all 100 different stickers of the different types of animals. And then what's so exciting is you make your own timeline. You see, you can just do one sticker a night instead of having a chocolate, and it's just good fun. Tear it out, stick it on the wall. There we go. Big stories. So this one, The 100 Species That Changed the World, this is the book here. It's called What on Earth Evolved? 100 Species That Changed the World. And I thought what I'm going to do is I'm going to take human beings as one of my species, and I'm going to choose 99 other species that I think qualify as being at least as successful, if not more successful, in the history of life on Earth as humans. Now, what would they be? Now, that's quite an interesting speculation in itself. Now, when you start thinking about writing books and stories, you have to sort of start thinking how you're going to organize things and write a narrative. And so I thought what I'll do is I'll choose 50 of these species that occurred before there are any people. So we can see what the world is like without us. So what are the rules for survival that have emerged over billions of years that are still very relevant in the natural world? And then when people come along, what are the most successful species today? And how have the rules for survival changed as a result of 7 billion people? And what does that tell us about human history? Because actually human history and biology should really be talk together, I think, in many ways. The amazing richness of stories you find when you combine history and nature together. And when you take a big perspective that includes natural history, and then you meet these creatures called humans, and then you see the impact on the world, you see human history very differently. It's without prejudice of culture. It's without prejudice of species. It's just looking at a global perspective on this amazing story and how it changes. So that's what I hope I can give you a flavor of this evening. There is a question. Every book I do always starts with a question, because curiosity is the kind of engine of finding out about things and having a fulfilling life, I think, actually. If your mind isn't full of questions, then it's something terrible can happen. You can get a disease, actually, quite easily, called boredom. I don't know if anybody's experiences. That's what happened to my younger daughter, and this is why we started home educating. She got bored. And so when we connected things together, actually the curiosity could flow. She wasn't bored again. And we all started learning again, and I started writing books, and there we go. So always asking questions. And the question that I have for you, which is the sort of key question of this book, I suppose, is this one here. What is the point of biodiversity? And, you know, it's a word that's used so much, isn't it, biodiversity? It's really important that we preserve biodiversity. What do we mean? Okay, having as many different types of species as possible, I suppose. But why? And actually, when you think about why is it so important, it gets a little bit more difficult. You know, you could think about that for a while and write an essay and try and come up with reasons why. But why don't we just focus on the species that we want and that makes the life better for people? You know, why does it matter if we have all these other species? If they're no use to us, why bother? They're obviously not relevant in the modern day and age. So therefore, and in fact, that's what, in fact, most people do think, actually, which is why we behave the way we do, I assume. So it's not, you know, it's quite difficult, actually, to get right under the skin of this question and think, well, why does biodiversity matter? And I think that is the question, at least I hope that there's a good answer to that question which comes out of this book. Now, these remote control clickers are a nightmare, aren't they? Because you wander around. Here we go. It's over here now. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken 100 species. They're all profiled in the book, so there are biographies of all these different living things and how they've changed the world. And there's a narrative in the book that explains the different groups they come from and gives you a narrative of life on Earth overall as you read through it. I've divided them into two colors, one because one group emerges before people, the other one has become successful as a result of people. And there isn't time, of course, to do 100 species, so I've chosen 12. Which is why I have 12 different numbers here. Well, they're not different. I suppose we have 1 to 7, which represent 7 of my favorite species that occurred before there are any people on the planet Earth. And they've all got different strategies for survival, which is rather why they're in different groups. Okay, they've got brilliant strategies for survival, by the way. This is very relevant to business. I often give this talk to business people because actually biodiversity and the tactics for survival in business are almost exactly the same, in my view. So there we are. And then 1 to 5 here are 5 choice species of things that have thrived as a result of people, which gives you an idea of how people and human culture has impacted the natural world for good or ill. That's up to you to decide, really, I guess. And so what I thought I'd do is I'm going to start off, start off here with the first group, the first 50, things that have emerged before there are any people, to see how nature has crafted and honed some amazing tactics for survival. And the diversity of these tactics, I hope, is the message that is going to come through loud and clear, because there's so many different ways to make a success of the world. I've called them the 7 wonders of the wild. Why not? Okay, here we go. Now, here they are. the words will all be obvious to you biologists, of course. And the number one is infection, which I have to say is the most amazing and brilliant strategy for survival. And I think what really brought this home to me was the Human Genome Project. You all know what I mean, when about in the year 2000, we cracked the DNA of what makes a human, and everyone got very excited. Business people got very excited, actually, because they thought they could design babies then. You could decide what colour your baby's hair was going to be and how high and all that sort of stuff. This could be a good business opportunity. It's a big biotech bubble. And then when they decoded the human gene, there were two teams, the American and the British team. They thought originally at the beginning of the project there'd be about 1 million different human genes, because we are right at the apex of evolutionary complexity, surely humans. When it came down to it, they discovered when they cracked the human gene that there are about 20,000 functioning genes, which is the same number, amazingly, as a mustard plant. So that's quite useful, okay? It puts us in our box a little bit. What was really also very interesting, about 70% of them have no operational purpose, so it seems. And they've been labeled junk DNA. You've come across the idea of junk DNA. It just doesn't seem to have any sort of biological function, really. But they're very interesting to one group of scientists, which are virologists. I don't know if any of you are going to be virologists or study viruses in any kind of depth. Fascinating. There's an amazing book that I could recommend to you on how viruses have impacted the course of evolution. And they do this through infection, particularly a certain type of virus called a retrovirus, which is a real kind of genius, because what it does is it's a bit like an old-fashioned film editor. You can imagine all the old celluloid reel films, and if you're editing a film, you cut a bit of film here and then it out, and you stitch two pieces together. That's kind of what a retrovirus does. It takes its genetic code, it infects a host, and it splices its genes, and it splices itself into the host genes, so that when the host reproduces, then it goes on to the next generation. A brilliant strategy for immortality, if you think about it, retroviruses. And so the junk DNA, the majority of it that's in our genes, are actually the remains of ancient retroviral infections. There is a record of billions of years of infection in our evolutionary line in every single one of our genes in our DNA, which is of no interest really to most biologists except for the ones interested in the history of infectious diseases and viruses, who are the most interesting biologists in some ways, I think. So I've started off with infection. I also thought it'd be rather fun to order all these 100 species into, the one that had the most impact in the history of the world to the one that had the least impact. Because I'm fed up with mathematicians having hijacked numbers and always saying, you can only use numbers when you're talking about quantitative data and that sort of stuff. I thought, why can't I just tell a story through numbers and just make it my opinion? So I've scored them all, and this one, that's number one, and you'll notice for each one of my species I've chosen an object. And the reason I do that is that rather than write notes and things, which actually writing things down in a list does induce forgetfulness. I don't know if you've come across this, because if you write a list, the first thing that happens is your hand tells your brain you don't have to remember what to get anymore or what to do because you've written it down, and your brain becomes forgetful. And in places like ancient Greece where they didn't have pen and paper, they had to learn the art of memory at school if they're going to give a speech or something, because they can't write things down, and they use it through everyday objects in their mind's eye. So I've chosen a few objects, and all I want you to do, really, of course you can write things down if you like, but just try and remember the objects, and then you should be able to remember the stories connected to them, I hope. That's the idea. So this one, which is a virus, is number 9 in my league table. I'm wondering if anybody can guess what it is. I'm going to ask somebody here to help me out. Actually, you'll notice there is no object here, because I'm hoping somebody in the room has got this object that I need for number 9. I'm going to pick on Richard again because he's just over there and he's a boy. Richard, could you come up here, please? Thank you. And could you just empty the contents of your trouser pockets and put them there on number 1? Okay, keep going. Now, this doesn't work very often these days. Okay, is that it? That's it. That is it. Ooh, okay, that wasn't very good. Okay, you can pick them up and you can sit down again now because we failed at that point. I shan't dwell and carry on going round. What Richard should have produced from his pocket is one of these, of course. People don't sort of carry them around much these days, so I have to do it myself. There we are. A handkerchief. Now, this handkerchief is representative of a virus that has really changed the world. Any thoughts, any suggestions which virus I might be speaking of? Influenza. Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. That's absolutely right. Influenza. Now, that is my number 9. That is a picture of a virus, which I think is amazing. It's like a spaceship, isn't it? It's just come down and it's latched itself onto a bacteria cell. You can imagine how small a bacteria is. Now you can see how small a virus is. and it's injecting its DNA into the bacteria cell, and then it's going to hijack the bacteria cell's copying machinery to make more viruses. And if you get influenza, it changes the behavior of the host by making you want to sneeze, because that's how the virus can spread. And other viruses infect the behavior of a host by making you want to bite, because it travels through saliva, like rabies does. Other ones are hemorrhaging type viruses, like Ebola. It's all through the bodily fluids, pussy spots like smallpox and all that kind of stuff. The strategies the virus have for changing the behavior of the host in order to spread themselves are amazing. Retroviruses are the ones that don't change your behavior. They just splice themselves in your genes, and then you do the rest. You know what I mean? Okay, so this is the one. Spanish flu, well, that killed 50 million people, just to bring a bit of human history into it. Anyone know why it's called Spanish flu? It's not as obvious as it seems. Killed more people than died in the First World War. It didn't come from Spain. Spain was one of the only countries not to have a ministry of propaganda. So when people started dying of influenza, it all got reported that they were dying in Spain because they didn't have press controls. Whereas over in Britain and America and other places like that, all of this was censored. They didn't want to scare people. So people thought of it as Spanish flu. It came from Mexico, actually. It came from pigs in Mexico. That's the theory. Anyway, these are my criteria for judging, etc. I won't go into to that. But actually, there are lots of viruses in my 100 species that I could mention. Smallpox. That killed most of the Native Americans. 20 million out of 26 million died, roughly, after Columbus, 100 years after Columbus arrived in the Americas, died of smallpox, because it comes from cows and they didn't have any farm animals. And that led to the slave trade, because there weren't enough people to work on the farms for the Europeans then, so they had to evacuate their people from somewhere else. They come from Africa. So you see how disease is changing human history. We think it's sort of leaders and conquerors and villains, but it's actually the forces of nature as much as anything else. Herpes, anybody here had chickenpox? Hands up if you've had chickenpox. Most people. You've got herpes in the ganglia of your ear. And it can come back to life for no apparent reason, and everybody understands, and causes shingles, maybe even connected with Alzheimer's. There's some research that's quite interesting. Anyway, so that's very successful. About 4 billion people have got herpes in some form because they've had chickenpox. HIV, AIDS, pottyvirus. That's interesting. Viruses affect plants as much as they do people. This one was responsible for the first stock market crash. I don't know if any of you are interested in the history of capitalism, but in 1630s, you could swap a Semper Augustus tulip for what is equivalent of £1 million today, because there was this huge, great demand for these marbled coloured leaves that this tulip. They were very rare as well, and it was caused by a virus, actually, the pottyvirus. And then people started to think, well, it's a bit silly paying £1 million for a tulip bulb, and there was a stock market crash. So there are links between, human history, economics, and all this kind of. That's the idea of the book, really, in connecting things together. So, okay, infection, very successful, wonderful. Symbiosis, there we are. Do you know what I mean by symbiosis? This is an incredibly successful strategy for survival in the wild. My example species is number 4, so this is really significant in my world in terms of the history of life on Earth, and it's connected to this amazing story about steam trains in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And in the 1930s, the steam trains were abandoned. And if you like steam trains, you can go to the Atacama Desert to a place called Baquedano Railway Junction, and you can see them all because they're still there. And they're perfectly well preserved because it's so dry there. And there's lots of these steam engines sort of not quite rusting, just abandoned in the desert. And here's a quiz question for you, okay? Why do you think these steam trains were abandoned? Do you think it was A, because they had invented diesel engines? B, because of the beginning of artificial fertilizers, C, land contamination, or D, a stock market crash? Okay, you've got no time to think of your answer. Hands up if you think it's A, please. You have to have a vote. A. Anybody think it's to do with diesel trains? B, please, artificial fertilizers. Anybody think that's 1, that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, good. C, land contamination. That's a popular one, especially in Bexley. Oh no, more over here, fantastic, good, most of you. And D, stock market crash. What, you put your hand down again. Oh, it's still up. So it looks like land contamination is the most popular answer. Interestingly, the correct answer is B, artificial fertilizers. There you are. Why is that? There is a species of bacteria called rhizobia, which has a symbiotic relationship with a family of plants called legumes. And in the Atacama Desert, it didn't used to be a desert if you go back, 15, 20,000 years ago. It was verdant and fertile, and there were lots of legumes like clover and stuff like that. And in the ground, these little bacteria, which you can see those little nodules on the roots, they have a symbiotic relationship with the plants so that the plants feed the bacteria glucose through their photosynthesis, which is great if you're a bacteria. And what the bacteria do is that they fix nitrogen from the air and turn it into nitrates, which is fertilizer for the plants, which is great for a plant. And they both rely on each other. That's the idea of a symbiotic relationship. You know, two completely separate species. I suppose a lichen is a really good example, isn't it? Algae and a fungi, you know, they require each other in order to survive. And so too do these. And what's happened is that as the climate has changed, the Atacama became a desert, and all the plants disappeared, but the nitrates that were fixed by the rhizobia stayed in the ground. And in those days, up till about 1915, if you want to make explosives, you need nitrates in the form of saltpeter. And the Germans like to get their saltpeter from Chile, which is where this is. And the British like to get their saltpeter from, any ideas? British traditionally always get their saltpeter from India, which is why India was such an important part of the British Empire, and why the Suez Canal, and be able to get our supplies of saltpeter through the Suez Canal all the way up to Britain was so important for us to be able to maintain our empire. So that's fine, except when the World War breaks out, World War I, the British have a great idea of blockading the Germans so they can't get supplies of saltpeter from Chile. So this is great because it means that they can't make their munitions. But who comes along but Fritz and Haber, the Haber-Bosch process, I don't know if you've come across that, which allows you to fix nitrogen from the air just in a factory. They invent this in 1915 as a pressure, really, to solve the problem of how can we make sure we can make munitions without having to get saltpeter from Chile, from the nitrates, from the rhizobia. So they managed to find a way of doing it in a factory, and of course that makes fertilizers and it makes munitions, and the whole world changes because you don't now need to. Of course we don't need India in the same way either as a result. So again, just trying to make a few connections really between these species and the impact on human history and a way of life that's incredibly successful in the natural world, which is a symbiotic relationship. So, okay, there we are. What have I got? Oh yes, I've got a steam train. There we are. You can see my object, number 2, steam train. There we are. Remember that one. Don't need to write it down. Lots of other symbiotic relationships. Coral, you know, if you think of the environment of coral or an oak tree on land and how symbiotic that is in terms of providing an environment for other species. If you look at the mycorrhiza relationship between fungi and plants, epitomized by this amazing thing called Prototaxites, which was a fungi that could grow 40 feet high. Can you imagine a 40-foot-high mushroom? That's what these guys are. I don't know if you can see them over here, these giant purple things. Before trees emerged on the land about 400 million years ago, there were these huge, great... The scientists have found the stumps of these in the deserts of Iran, and they thought for years and years that they were trees, but they're not. They've sequenced the genes, and they're giant fungi called Prototaxites. And underground, the roots, the hyphae, would go on for miles and miles, and they'd be linking together all the different plants so they could live away from the seashore, because then the fungi could provide the water and the nutrients, and the plants could find the glucose, and hey, presto, together symbiotically we can invade and make a new ecosystem on the land. So ants and acacia, the great ants actually nibble away all the plants near an acacia, so an acacia is safe to grow, and the acacias feed the ants with little kind of galls underneath their leaves. So anyway, you'll find lots of examples of symbiosis. Collaboration is slightly different. Collaboration is a slightly different deal. We don't depend on each other for survival. We'll collaborate if it's in our interest to do so, and if it isn't, we'll just go our own way. Okay, that's fine, that's cool. Best example of this, this is quite fun. Right, so I want someone to guess which relate, I need a volunteer. That's always good, isn't it? Yes, madam, fantastic. Is your name
Yes, Sharon.
Sharon, brilliant. That's very kind, Sharon. I'm very pleased. Now, this is particularly exciting because it involves putting a blindfold on. Okay, Sharon, so if you turn around there, and I'm just going to pop this on you over here, that's all right. I hope you're all impressed with how brave Sharon is here. Can you, now, Sharon, I want you to tell me how many fingers am I holding up? Just have a guess.
3.
Excellent. Okay, that's fine. Now, Sharon, I'm going to hand you a bowl. Okay, there we are, there's a bowl. Got it?
Yeah.
Good. Now, I'm going to put an example of the particular species that I'm thinking of, it's a very collaborative one, in this bowl. How are you feeling, Sharon? All right? Okay? Good. Hang on. There we are. Okay. Good. And now all I want you to do is to dip your little fingers in the bowl, and I want you to tell me what you think it is. It's fun, isn't it? Yeah. No, get a few fingers in there. Give me a few adjectives. How does it feel?
Slimy.
Slimy. Got it in one. Fantastic, Siri. You're brilliant. Give you a round of applause. Fantastic. Goody. There we are. Don't lick your fingers. Someone around there, I did ask for a tissue because I thought that was going to be a little bit... So, we have got it in one. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. The answer is number 74, is the slime. Now, slime is amazing. Have you studied the life cycle of a slime mold, by the way? You haven't done that yet. I can highly recommend it. It's amazing. So slime is like tiny little amoeba, single-cell little amoebas that feed off bacteria. And they all go about their own little way, find a bit of bacteria, have their meal, that's lovely. Except if there isn't very much bacteria around, they collaborate, and they join together to make a slug. And the reason they do that is because then if one of them finds food, because food is scarce, they can pass it along the chain, take a bit each, all right? And then they'll all get fed, and the chances of survival there are much greater if you collaborate and form a multicellular slug. And then there's lots of food around, they just split up and go their own way again. And there was a Japanese scientist in about the year 2000 who did an amazing experiment where he put lots of little blobs of slime in a maze, which you can see up here. And there was no food in the maze, but he put some food at the entrance and the exit. And within 2 hours of putting the little blobs of slime in the maze, guess what? They'd all collaborated, because there was no food. They'd all connected together, and guess what? They had solved the best and most efficient way through the maze. And he said this is the most basic form of advanced intelligence in life on Earth, is in here, in the slime mold. They can solve the puzzle of how to get through the maze. Okay, self-organizing systems. You will find nature is absolutely bursting with these things. In fact, if you think about ourselves, homeostasis, you know what I mean? It's a self-organizing system, isn't it? The human immune system, it's a self-organizing system. If you think about the behavior of, ants in an ant's nest, perhaps, or bees when they're swarming, or wasps when they're swarming, etc. Most of these are good examples. We've got slime, I've got other examples of collaborative organisms, coral and oak, etc., etc. So, there we are. Number 4, this is the one that most people would associate, I suppose, with Charles Darwin and with evolution generally in the vernacular, is to do with competition. It's about survival of the fittest, whatever fittest is supposed to mean. And competition is a very popular way of being able to survive, but only in a certain sort of niche of life, I would suggest. Probably the best way to think of it, the simplest way, is if you think of your pyramid of life, most of the all the energy ultimately that powers life on Earth comes from the sun, pretty much, except, I suppose, down at the bottom of the sea, those hydrothermal vents and stuff. That's different if you're a bacteria, but for most of us up here on the surface, this is the case. And the plants absorb it, and only 10% of the sunlight, the energy from sunlight, is available to a herbivore. So that's why, cows and sheep spend all days munching grass, because, they have to get that 10% up the whole time. And that's fine, and they're not typically aggressive species because, the grass is just there and you can nibble it, that's fine. But if you get your energy from other animals, of which there's only 10% available of the 10%, generally speaking, you get your energy from eating other creatures, like eating herbivores, then that's a bit more tricky because there are 2 problems. One is there isn't so much energy available, so you need to be more aggressive. The second is that, generally speaking, your food's got legs, so it can run away. So you have to have different strategies than a sheep or a goat. So the strategies for carnivores require more aggression, generally speaking. I have one here, number 38. There's a very fine example of a very aggressive species. I've got it in my box. I've got my objects in my box here. Hang on a minute. Anybody like to guess for me what I've got here? Rather splendid example. It is a shark's tooth. Fantastic. Anybody want to guess how old this shark's tooth might be? Millions of years. You're absolutely right. It's about 100 million years old. Isn't that fantastic? How old could it be? When do you think sharks first appear in the story of life on Earth? Any thoughts? That's where a timeline is useful. The first one is about 400 million years ago. If you think our species, Homo sapiens, about 160,000 years old. 400 million years for the first shark. It shows you what brilliant survivors they are in the story of life on Earth. Any idea where I got this shark's tooth? Museum. eBay. Actually, is the best place for getting that kind of a thing, just so you know, if you're into collecting stuff like that. Anyway, sharks. Now, there are lots of strategies for shark survival. In fact, the vertebrate immune system first emerges in sharks, so that's quite interesting. But there's this one here, which I would briefly share with you, called oophagy. Has anybody come across oophagy? Well, basically, not all sharks do this, but some sharks do this. The mother sharks, they have little eggs which hatch out inside the mother's body. They don't lay the eggs, the sharks hatch out. And they swim around inside the mother shark for about 2 to 3 weeks. They usually have about 8 little baby sharks that hatch out. And during this 2 to 3 weeks, you get a rather gruesome performance of that game. Do you know the game Musical Chairs? You know the one I mean? And it's the one who can survive, basically. It's about who can eat each other up and then which one is left over after 2 or 3 weeks. And that is the one that is then born into the wild, you see, into the sea, which is a great way of making sure that the fittest, strongest sharks are the ones that always survive. And of course, if you're a shark, you're a carnivore, you need to be able to be strong and fit in order to be aggressive, in order to get your food, it makes sense. So in that sense, there's a nice strategy. And in fact, it's Similar sort of strategies you will find in all sorts of... Dragonflies are very good. I don't know if you know the story of the dragonflies. That they were one of the first creatures to evolve the ability to be able to fly. Have I lost my ability to go on? Here we are. Dragonflies. You can find the first dragonfly about 350 million years ago, but these ones, the ancestors of today's dragonflies, could grow up to a meter big. Can you imagine a meter wide dragonfly? Because there's more oxygen, you see, so these creatures, insects, they don't have hearts to pump things around their bodies, so they rely on the density of oxygen in the air to be able to determine how big they can grow, because they go through little tubes. And there was more oxygen in those days, because there's more plants and things that just emerged on the ground, and so these creatures grow up to a meter. And anyway, the mating ritual of dragonflies has remained to this day, and it's a very, very aggressive one, because they used to be at the top of the kind of aggression stakes, really. And what happens is that the male dragonfly captures a female as a hostage and copulates for roughly a couple of hours, really. And then just before I can say this because we're all consenting adults, I hope here, is that just before the male dragonfly injects his sperm into the female, he has a little well-adapted piece on his genitals, which is like a scoop. So he can make sure that if any other male dragonflies got there first, he can scoop out their semen before he squirts his own in. And then he will keep the female hostage for a couple of, until she's laid her eggs to make sure that no other dragonfly comes and does the same thing. So, you think it's bad in some parts of the world in human culture, try it out in dragonflies. Okay, so that's competition. Now, there is another way of life. Oh, hang on, what was it? I missed it out here. Parasitism. That is a brilliant way. So this is a relationship which is one-sided. So you want to keep the host alive, but one side is going to do much better than the other side because it's going to live off the other one. It doesn't want to kill the other one because that's the one it wants to live off. So it's a kind of unequal relationship. Lots of those in nature, as you know, in the plant world and animal world. Number 14 is very important. And it's to do with a quiz question here. There's a Scotsman called Alexander Wood. He invented something in 1849 that really made a huge difference, really, between nature and humanity. And actually, it's very easy to know what he got because I've got one of them on my desk. He invented this thing here, the syringe, hypodermic syringe. But nature invented a hypodermic syringe, interestingly enough, about 150 million years ago, which is called the mosquito, which is basically a flying hypodermic syringe. And there are about 300 known diseases that pass between mosquitoes and human beings because they carry all these little parasites. It's only the female mosquitoes that bite. The males are herbivores. They live off nectar. So if you get bitten by a mosquito, you know it's a female, and they need the protein from your blood to be able to lay their eggs. Interestingly, it was a story not very dissimilar from mosquitoes that led Charles Darwin to sort of lose any residual faith in a god, because there is a certain type of wasp, a parasitic wasp, and what it does is it injects its eggs into a spider, a living spider, and then these eggs hatch out inside the living spider and hijack its silk-making apparatus so that they can then make cocoons for themselves, and basically the little spiders inside, the little eggs of the wasps inside the spiders then will eat the spider from the inside out. And Darwin kind of thought there can't be such a thing as a benevolent God who would have made a world this way. And so he kind of sits outside church from then on, lets his wife go instead. Anyway, there you are. That's just a little connection there with parasites. Parasites are fleas, tsetse flies, ticks, water molds. Water molds responsible for the potato famine in the 1848 to 1850 in Ireland, for the spread of Catholicism westwards. Basically, it's caused by water mold. When you think about it, if you start connecting biology with human culture, you'll see these things. Ticks, which is where you get Lyme disease from. Tsetse flies, that delayed the development of agriculture in Africa for thousands of years, which is why Africa was on a different trajectory in terms of modern civilization, perhaps from other ones. Fleas, of course, bubonic plague, these are all vectors of parasitic diseases. So, parasitism, co-evolution, just because there's so many nice stories about this, it's to do with a relationship where it's a collaborative relationship, but not in real time, over many generations. And particularly the world of insects and flowers have a good example of co-evolution and how this has worked as a strategy for survival. Number 97 is a species which is this one here. I was going to ask somebody to guess what it was, but as I put this title up on the screen, it's not going to work, is it really? Have a smell, though. What's your name?
Vicky.
Vicky.
Nikki.
Nikki. Isn't that lovely? Isn't it beautiful? Anyone wants that? Do you know, I've had this vanilla pod now for about 4 years, and it still just smells great. Have a little smell. Oh, isn't that lovely? Isn't that great? It's just different. Oh, wow. Okay. So, anyway, this is what Europeans thought when they went to Mexico, when Europeans started colonizing Mexico, and they fell in love with vanilla. And they tried to take the vanilla to other parts of the world with the same sort of environment so they could grow it, because they love to put vanilla in their hot chocolate and stuff. And so they took it to Madagascar, but the problem was they took the vanilla plants, grew perfectly well, but they never fruited. You never got those vanilla pods. And then it was actually a slave, an unknown slave. His name's Edward Albius. He's not written any history books, but I found out about him. And he discovered why these vanilla orchids didn't actually pollinate in Madagascar, because there's a certain type of bee called the Melipone bee that's the only bee that knows how to pollinate a vanilla orchid. And a vanilla orchid has an amazing strategy for preserving its pollen to make sure that only Melipone bees will actually get access to the pollen. It has an invisible little cap over its stamen called a rostellum. And the Melipone bee knows the secret of how to open this rostellum, which is brilliant for a vanilla orchid because it means that it doesn't have to make very much pollen. It's very efficient because it knows that every time an insect comes and gets its pollen, it's a Melipone bee who's only going to go to another vanilla orchid, which is, in fact, what it is targeted marketing. I don't know if any of you are interested in marketing, but it was invented here in the world of coevolution between insects and flowers. A brilliant target, the sort of broadcast marketing strategy is, grass in the wind. It might go anywhere, who knows, very wasteful. Targeted marketing is all about coevolution, and there it is. So this guy, Edmund Albius, he invents a little a way of opening the rostellum using a little stick with a little device on the end, and it's still today for vanilla that's grown naturally in Madagascar, they have to hand pollinate all the vanilla orchids because there's no Melipone bees there to be able, and they use Edmund Albius' little device to do that, which is a rather nice story. So coevolution, and then other examples. I haven't got time because I don't want to run out of time because here we are. It's racing ahead. And final one in the world without us, I would say, is reason problem solving. This is a very effective strategy for survival. You may think, of course, human beings are the kind of ultimate example of this, perhaps, which is why I have, as my exhibit number 7, brains. Do you know brains? Who does? You don't know brains? From the Thunderbirds, yes. He's lost his glasses, unfortunately, my moment, but he's still here. Anyway, he solves all the problems, brains on Thunderbirds. International Rescue. Yeah, okay, you've got lots to look forward to if you haven't seen that. Anyway, there are lots of creatures, not just humans, that use the power of reason to try and come up with solutions for better survival. We've got our ancestors, like Australopithecus, who gets up on 2 feet, Homo erectus, that invents fire, elephants, who are incredibly intelligent, dogs, whales, foxes, cats, rats. I would suggest you all of them use an element of reason and problem solving. And in birds, actually, you find crows. I should have put them in there, shouldn't I? Who are very good at being able to use tools and all the rest of it. So there is a bit of a difference, though, between humans and why our brains are so big. Our DNA is about 98% the same as our closest biological relative, chimpanzees or bonobos, but our brains are 4 times bigger. And there's been loads of research as to why our brains are so much bigger. It seems to have happened over the last 3 million years since our ancestors got on 2 feet. And the left side of our brain is responsible, really, for operating the right side of our body. And that's all about fragmented, focused learning and manipulation of the world, which is why most people are very good at manipulating the world with their right hand, controlled with their left side of the body. So it's thought tool making, from when we got onto 2 feet, is responsible in part for this big sort of selective pressure in favor of bigger brains. The other side of our brain, which is the right side of the brain, which is more interested in the big picture, in emotions, in music, and in unsolved mysteries and problems, and taking a more holistic view, that side of the brain is possibly much more exaggerated in humans because we don't use the same system as our ancestors did for mate selection. For example, anybody here have a dog? Yes, fantastic. And what's the name of your dog? Okay, actually, you're a bad example. You've got a dog.
I have 4, Bear, Lydia, and Minnie, and...
Do you have a male dog?
Yeah, Bear.
Bear the dog, okay. And your name is?
Calypso.
Sorry, Lipso?
Calypso.
Calypso, great, okay, Calypso, great. So my name's Chris, and my dog's called Flossie, right? Okay, so we go for a dog walk, and Flossie and Bear meet each other, and what's the first thing they do? Sniff each other's what? Butts. Okay, let's go. Bottoms, let's be, okay, they sniff each other's bottoms. And why do they sniff each other's bottoms? Now, you have to go back to the age of the dinosaurs to figure this out, because our ancestors evolved and went hunting in the dark when the dinosaurs were asleep. And when you go hunting in the dark, and there are two things you need to survive. You need food, so you need to smell food, which we're quite good at. The other thing is you need a mate, otherwise you're not going to survive into the future very well. And the best way of finding a mate in the dark, Calypso, is not to use your eyes, but to use your nose. So that's what they do, and they sniff each other's behinds because that's where the sweat glands are, and in there is a little signature of what their genes are, which is a pheromone. And that pheromone can tell the dog whether or not they're good to mate with, because what you're looking for, this is true of humans too, by the way, is somebody whose genes are as different from yours as possible, because then your offspring will have a better representation of the gene pool, which means they will be better adapted against viral attack. And that's what the dog is looking for instinctively by smelling pheromones. Now, we've lost this ability, Calypso, because when I meet Calypso on a dog walk, what's the first thing we do?
Shake hands or
Maybe. Say hello. Do we sniff each other's bottoms? No. And this is actually quite interesting. Why don't we sniff each other's bottoms? The answer, it seems, amazingly goes back to a retrovirus infection, one 25 million years ago, one 4 million years ago. And you can find this in the human genome, which was knocked out because that little virus inserted itself into our genome in just the place where the olfactory system responsible for mate selection occurs. And we couldn't anymore sniff a mate to see whether they were good to mate with. So we have to use something else instead, which is visual recognition based on symmetry. So I will decide as a value judgment whether Calypso is good to mate with based on her standard deviation from a given norm in a population as to whether, she conforms or she doesn't. So symmetry, you will find all over culture, is an advertisement of fit genes. Whether it's the Palace of Versailles or whether it's Henry VIII's garden or whether it's stripy grass. Have you noticed how all those boys love stripy grass or pinstripe suits and stuff like that? Anyway, so I digress because it is thought that the visual recognition system, which requires much more brain processing power, is another reason why our brains are so much bigger. Which, of course, we've adapted our big brains for problem solving, and there we are. So, I digress a little bit, but there we are. I present to you 7 different modes of survival in the wild that have occurred basically and evolved before there were in a world of 7 billion people. And they're all very valid. You see, biodiversity is very important. The more different modes of survival, then the more robust life is. Now, if we quickly flip into 50 species that have thrived as a result of people, having so many people, you will see the rules of nature have changed. And I would suggest to you there are 5 key criteria, if you're not a human species, as to how you're going to survive in the wild these days. And these are the following 5. You have to be tasty. You have to, in some way, improve the comfort of people. You have to give people company. You have to do something funny or exciting to the people's brains. Or you need to look lovely and symmetrical. If you can conform to one of those things, you will become very, very successful. And lots of creatures, thanks to biodiversity, by the way, have become very successful in a world full of 7 billion people and 24 billion chickens. So, very quickly, food. My example species is this one here. Hopefully you'll know this story, if I can get it to where it's number 17. There's a lady who's looking pretty cross down there and a guy climbing up what is a rather large beanstalk. His name is? Jack. And why is Mum looking so cross? Because he's sold the cow. He's become a vegetarian, basically. He's sold it and he's swapped the cow for some beans. And she doesn't think this is a good idea. So the cow, there we are, is off. But actually, cows, which is why I have a milk bottle here to represent my first species for you here in the human world, are very significant. Roughly 18% of carbon emissions these days come out of the back of cows. That's methane. There are 1 billion cows on the planet Earth. Huge contributor to global warming, just through cows, if you see it. So already they qualify pretty high up on the list of species that are having dramatic impact today when you look at it, cows. And of course the relationship of cows in human culture, we go to India, it's a sacred cow. And there's a very beautiful history of the cow if you look at Indian culture, etc. So, but there are lots of creatures that are good to eat. And sheep, rice, pigs, maize, potatoes, chickens, olives, wheat, they've all changed the world. I haven't got time to tell you their stories, but they're all there if you're interested, and they're all amazing. They're all biology and history interwoven together. Comfort. Okay, what I have here is my exhibit. Oh, I got them the wrong way around, thought I had. Is a lovely pair of made from cotton. Cotton has changed the world. My goodness, cotton is so demanding of the water supply that you can see here, this is a picture of the Aral Sea. You probably know this story, as it was in the 1970s. And then when the Soviet army needed to equip all its troops with cotton uniforms, which they did, is they diverted the rivers into the Aral Sea, into the cotton plantations, and the Aral Sea shrank to only about 10% of its former size, as you can see. This is how it looks today. There are the 40,000 fishermen used to be there, and there are these ships, and they're all in the desert with camels going by. All because the water was diverted because cotton is so brilliant for making clothes, but cotton needs lots of water, and you see how cotton has changed the world as a result, you know. So another little example. Oh, I've missed out a few there, which you can see because they've got fabulous stories. If you're interested in things like, oh, there we are, rubber, silkworms, eucalyptus, they've all changed the world just because of that. Company, very important, number 42. Here we are, a little question for you. Gellert was a 13th century Irish bloodhound. That's a dog, by the way. And he was put down after his owner, Prince Llewellyn, after he, A, killed a wolf, B, mauled a baby, C, ate the prince's lunch, or D, herd a flock of sheep off a hill, off a cliff. There we go. So how many think that Gellert was killed by Prince Llewellyn because Gellert killed a wolf? Hands up. It's okay. You put a hand up. That's good. That's one. 2, because Gellert mauled a baby. 3, 4, 5. Because he ate the prince's lunch. Ooh, yeah, good reason to kill a dog. 4, because he herd a flock of sheep off a cliff. Oh, I think all that one always wins. You might be thinking there of Gabriel Oak, but anyway, no. It was because Prince Llewellyn arrived home after hunting. He found his baby son lying on the ground in a pool of blood, and a blood-stained Gellert sitting close by. In a fury, Llewellyn impaled the dog before spotting a dead wolf that loyal Gellert had killed while saving the life of his master's heir. And there's a shrine to Gellert in a little Welsh town. It's very sad. But you see, it's the relationship with dogs. They've been looking after us for thousands of years, and they found a way of living with us that has changed human culture. Because they provide such good company. And there are other ones on the screen there I can mention. Stimulation, number 4. This is one of my favorites. There's an amazing crop that is grown in America. In fact, it's grown all over the world, I should say. And it's changed the world. I'm just wondering if you can guess which crop this is. There's a quiz question here, I hope. Yes, number 54 in the list of the 100 species. This one, approximately $36 billion of this crop is grown in the United States each year. Any guesses as to what it is? Totally changed. Corn. Wow. Yeah, could be. What do you think? Tobacco. That's a good one, actually. You know, it's not tobacco and it's not corn. It's this one. Cannabis. Cannabis. Now, we should talk a little bit about cannabis. I had a dog bowl for Gellert, by the way. There we are. Cannabis. I've chosen a rubber because there's an amazing story about cannabis. It's got an incredible strategy for survival, which I have to tell you about because it's so amazing. It doesn't have a toxin in it that kills any of its predators, like sort of some fungi do and some poisonous plants. It has a chemical called THC. And THC does something which is even better than a toxin. It induces forgetfulness. So if you imagine a cow comes along, eats some cannabis, okay, has a cannabis, and he thinks, that's rather amazing, I like that cannabis, but he can't remember where it is. Because the THC's it's just kind of got all kind of dizzy and fuzzy and don't know where it's gone. Right. And what's so brilliant about it is that the cannabis never has any problem with its predators, you know, developing an immunity because of sexual reproduction, creating diversity. Because, of course, none of them die off. They just forget, you know, where it is. And there are these Israeli scientists not that long ago that discovered that there's a chemical in the human brain that's quite similar called anandamide. That's the name they gave it anyway, which is the Sanskrit for bliss. And anandamide induces forgetfulness in people. And it's very important for women at the moment of childbirth. I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but if you haven't, apparently it is pretty awful. And anyway, the thing is, it's very important because if you don't have this anandamide kicking in at the moment where it gets the most excruciatingly painful, you probably would never have another child, which is bad news, you know, biologically speaking. So anandamide kicks in, you can't really remember how awful it was, so then you go on and you know, have another one and another one and another one. So that's good. And boys can experience it too. If you have a very traumatic moment, like, you know, you get your arm shot off in the war or something, then you won't remember how awful it was because anandamide kicks in as a sort of self-preservation. But the thing is, anandamide metabolizes in about 2 minutes, so it disappears. But THC from cannabis goes down exactly the same pathways in the brain as anandamide, causes forgetfulness, but it takes 2 or 3 hours to metabolize. Which is why, apparently, for people who enjoy cannabis, they kind of forget all of their anxieties about the future. And they forget about all their guilts in the past. And they have this wonderful feeling of sereneness and calmness in the present. Because it's this forgetfulness that's in the THC that makes it so appealing. And of course, that was why cannabis is one of various different species that have thrived in a world of 7 billion people, because it mimics or it does things or goes down pathways in the brain that make us feel better for one reason or another. So there's chocolate, there's coffee as a stimulant, there are There's ergot, which is the base for LSD, by the way. There's yeast, of course, which is what we use for making alcohol. These have all got amazing stories of either stimulation or opiates, which induce sort of more relaxation. So that's another criteria for these creatures. I won't dwell on that slide. Don't think I've got time, but it's very interesting. This last one, sensuality, I've kind of covered because I was trying to explain the theory as to why our right hemispheres are so sort of large compared with other creatures, because we use visual recognition for our mate selection. Just to sort of add a bit of colour to that, the species I've chosen, which is looking rather sorry for itself, I'm afraid, is a rose, but it's kind of lost its stalk here, so it's the top of a rose. That's all I can offer you. And we love roses because they look so beautiful. They appeal to us visually. We are a visual species. That's why I do these timelines, because they're visualizations of narratives, and that makes them interesting to learn from, because it's not just words, it's also pictures arranged in a certain way. And so this experiment, because you're all scientists, many of you here, I thought I'd share it with you, and because it's connected with Charles Darwin, I thought it was relevant, was conducted by Charles Darwin's cousin, who's called Francis Galton. I don't know if you heard about Francis Galton, really interesting guy. And he lived in America for a while. He was born in Birmingham, actually. And after Darwin's theory of natural selection became kind of common knowledge, about 1870, 1880, people, particularly in America, got very excited about the idea of being able to, domesticate species. Because, if you can focus the gene pool in a way that happens in nature, then maybe we could do the same thing for people. And Galton gets very excited by this, being sort of related to Darwin, and he's the father of something called eugenics. I don't know if you come across eugenics, which isn't a very good thing, hasn't got very much of a good press these days. But he thought this is brilliant, because what we'll do is we will try and find the ultimate criminal face. Okay, and photographers just come in at the same time, by the way. It's ideal. So he goes around death row in the US, and he takes pictures of all the criminals who are being sentenced to death. And he thinks, if I can create the ultimate criminal face, all we need to do is we need to just get those people together, using our little photo kit, and sterilize them. Because then, over a few generations, we'll weed out all the criminal, evil people from society, and everybody will be nice to each other, and we won't need prisons, and it will be much cheaper, and we'll all be happier. Eugenics, right? That's what happens in the natural world, isn't it? Domestication, with all that kind of stuff. Anyway. So he takes these pictures, and he's expecting everybody to say the guy in the middle, where it says composite, is the most ultimate evil face. But actually, when he shows these pictures to everybody, the one in the middle that's the composite of all the other ones is the one they say is most attractive, not least attractive. And the reason is because it's averaged out all the asymmetries and created something that conforms to the norm, just like Calypso over there. If I was meeting her and saying, wow, she conforms to the norm of a given population, how beautiful she is, just the same way. So our culture is really driven by beauty. And in the natural world, things that conform, if you can cut grass and create stripes, you're going to feel better about yourself, particularly if you're a boy. In religions, like the lotus flower, it's the symbol of divinity because it's so beautifully symmetrical. It's like a connection with divine, because in our brains we associate symmetry with something as perfect, because that's how we do our mate selection, basically. So there are various different species that I've featured that are all good to eat, or they are, for example, a carrot. If you picked up a carrot in a supermarket and it had a knobble on it, you put it back again. It's complete value judgment. It's a perfectly good carrot, but it's just the way we're wired, really. So we have these different creatures with these different ways of survival, just to summarize in our last 2 minutes. Lots of amazing strategies in the world where there are no people, which you can see, which are still operating all around us, and very successful. And equally, nature's been so incredibly robust that even in a world of 7 billion people, it's managed to adapt other strategies that work for survival. And therefore, you can only conclude that nature survives, and has survived over 4 billion years, thanks to the incredible variety of different living things there are on the planet Earth, which is summed up in a word, biodiversity. And the way I think of biodiversity is I think of it as life's insurance policy. Okay, if things change, if let's say there's more oxygen in the air, or let's say the temperature decreases dramatically, or let's say there's a new type of predator around, or let's say there's 7 billion people, as long as there are enough diversity, life will be able to adapt. It's a self-correcting system, which is beautiful and brilliant. That is the role of biodiversity, an insurance policy against change. Because the one thing you can be sure of in the story of life on Earth in the past and in the future is the one constant is going to be change. And life has been built on that premise, and biodiversity. That is why it's so important to preserve biodiversity. If we create a monoculture with just a few species, the ones that we like, and nothing else, how vulnerable does life become? Because if we disappear, or we do something stupid, then the whole system risks being failure fundamentally. And that's where monocultures, and it's true in business as well as it is in biology. If you create a business with only one type of personality in it, as soon as that personality isn't relevant anymore in the environment, that business fails. So the more diversity in human culture, the more diversity in biology, the stronger and more robust the system. And to just try and give you a metaphor for this, in my last minute, I have with me a little train set. Because I was trying to find a way of trying to make this point about self-correcting systems and biodiversity. And the best I could come up with was this. I want you to imagine that this little railway set here represents a journey over 4 billion years, okay? And the reason it's changing direction is because it's always changing. Over 4 billion years, life has changed dramatically because the environment's changed with it, the plate tectonics, the temperatures, the oxygen levels, and everything else, right? Now, if you take that timeline of 4 billion years, and if you were to design life in the shape of a candle, like this, right? When life changes, what do you think is going to happen if I roll this candle down the railway track? When it gets to a corner, what's going to happen to the candle? Emma. It's going to fall off. Yeah, absolutely. That's the plan. Anyway, that's what should happen. I'm hoping, if this hasn't sort of gone completely out of line, that candle fell off, right, at the first available moment. How profound is that? Don't build life like a candle. That's a monoculture, by the way. A little tweak in the design, interestingly enough, which can be accomplished via 2 plastic champagne glasses you can get from any camper van shop with a bit of sellotape, and you can take off the little ends like this, and it creates a slightly different shape, which has these kind of flanges at the side. This is now a self-correcting system. It's a mechanical self-correcting system, as opposed to a biological one, but I'm hoping it will demonstrate that without any kind of tricks, without a computer, without any hokey-cokey, or without even a god, you will find that as I set life down on this railway track of 4 billion years, even though it's changing all the time by going around the corners, this design, a self-correcting system, will stay on the tracks all the way around. Okay, and this is where I take a big deep breath, and I hope for the best. And I hope you can see that our little guy goes round and round, adapting, 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 all the way, and never comes off. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for a very few quick questions, if anyone has any.
Oh, yes. Any questions, please? That would be fine. Otherwise, I've got books and things up in the library. If anybody would like a book, I've got Pocket, which I can put cash in, and I've got a credit card machine I can put cards in, all that kind of, I can sign books, all that kind of stuff, timelines, sticker books and everything. But, has anybody got any questions? No question, nobody? Yes, at the back. Yep.
How did you make the leap from studying history to studying a lot about, obviously, biology and the history of the world? I just find it quite interesting to see how much knowledge you've obviously taken in over the years.
Well, it's sweet of you to ask. Basically, when my older daughter she's now 19, but when she was 8, she got bored at school, as it happens. And so we didn't mean to, but we took her out of school. We found another school. We couldn't find another school that seemed right. So we home educated for about a year. Actually, we ended up home educating for 5 years, and took her other sister out. And it was a complete kind of eureka moment for me, because I realized that, I wasn't taught at school in an interconnected way. I was a victim, like I think we all are, of a culture that fragments knowledge into pieces. And it becomes very difficult to imagine, if you're studying biology, why, First World War in Germany, saltpeter and chili might be relevant. But it is, And so I discovered, she was interested in penguins. Which is great, penguins are fantastic. And we discovered we could learn about everything through penguins. We learn about Antarctica, about plate tectonics, about ice, different states of matter, stories about ice, the Titanic. We could learn about poetry. We do creative writing about penguins, and they huddle in groups. And there's so much we could do that I thought, if only I can connect things together, then it doesn't really matter. If you're curious enough, you will find that there are themes there and stories that are seldom told, because we're always looking at things in little isolated fragments. And so I looked for a book that would help guide me from the beginning of time to the present day. And I go into a bookshop, and I said, I want a book on the history of the world, please. And the lady behind the counter says, well, you can go that way into the science section, and it's great. It tells you all about plate tectonics, about nature, and all the things about evolution. When it gets to people, though, it stops, because it's not really science. So then you have to go to the other side of the bookshop, go to the history section, and you buy the same book. It's got the same title, A History of the World, and it starts 7,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, as if nothing else happened before. And I realized, we are so completely kind of into this world of splitting things up. I've got to write a book and connect it together. So that's when I wrote the first one, and then I wrote the second one, and then I wanted to make this more available to younger people, because how are they going to read a giant big book? So it's taken me down this route, really, of wanting to connect things together and using curiosity as your kind of life force, because then anything connects together. And that's the way the brain evolved, because I'm most passionate about understanding the brain, because that's the thing, that's what's in the room here, lots of brains. And if you understand a bit about how they work naturally and how they want to learn by connecting things together, which is the whole neuron system, rather than splitting it up into little bits. The brain doesn't have a little bit of biology and history and mechanics and economics. That's not how it works. It creates maps that are interconnected of all the totality of experience and created in real time, and it's fascinating. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but thank you for asking. Any other thoughts?
Yeah,
questions?
Possibly time for one more question.
One more
anyone
question?
has one. I'd just like to say thank you then again for a fantastic talk, and we'll be upstairs.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Great pleasure. Thank you.